All right, hey, good afternoon. Welcome to the Heartland Institute. According to the radio this morning, there was supposed to be torrential rain, damaging hail, and high winds right now. Uh, Global warming strikes Arlington Heights, Illinois. But we see none of that, so I guess we're kind of blessed. Those of you who are participating online, watching this as a live stream, you didn't miss any violent weather, and we welcome you to this event. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our keynote speaker, Cedric Keith. He's here to discuss his new book titled The Dying Fish. Before I do that, I'd like to say a few words about the Heartland Institute and myself. So I'm Joseph Bast. I'm the president of the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute is a national nonprofit research organization based here in Arlington Heights, Illinois. We were started 32 years ago. We publish books, small books, big books, books that are in between. We do 4 monthly public policy newspapers on healthcare, environment, budget and tax issues, and school reform. We host events, small events like this one here this evening, big events. We've had 700-800 people attend some of our events in New York City, for example, on climate change. We address a wide range of issues, everything from school reform and healthcare to environment and tax policy. We have a point of view. We think that freedom is the most important idea of our time, of our era. We think freedom is under attack, and it needs to be defended. Groups like the Heartland Institute were created to defend freedom, to explain how we can solve social and economic problems peacefully and voluntarily instead of having to rely on the force of government to achieve these results. We rely on voluntary contributions. The Heartland Institute doesn't solicit or accept any money from the government. We feel you can't hardly criticize the hand that feeds you, so if you depend on government for money, you're probably not going to be a reliable critic of the government. We have about 6,000 donors, individuals all across the country who believe, as we do, that freedom is the solution to the problems that the country faces. We are meeting today in the Andrew Breitbart Freedom Center. Andrew Breitbart was a remarkable guy, a patriot, a very courageous advocate of freedom, died much too soon. BreitbartNews.com and several other Breitbart properties are out there continuing his effort to bring the message of freedom to a large popular audience. We got permission from his family and Breitbart News to name this room after him, and we're very pleased that we were able to do that. So, what's going on this evening? A couple of months ago, I got an email from a guy I'd never heard of, and he said, I spent several years hiking the Appalachian Trail, and in the course of hiking that trail, I came to sort of an appreciation of free market or libertarian ideas and philosophy. And I thought maybe on a chance that the Heartland Institute would be interested in the book that I'm writing on that subject. Well, the author of that email had no way of knowing that when I was 20 years old or 19 years old, I hiked the Appalachian Trail. And it was a life-transforming event for me. It was a tremendous thing. And I think, like this email writer, that experience kind of moved me from kind of left liberal. I was subscribing to Earth First at the time. I was pretty green, pretty deep green. And over time, I've evolved, kind of into much more of a libertarian. But the experience on the path was really amazing. So I looked up this guy online. He has a Facebook page, and I found out that he was working as a janitor when he wasn't hiking the trail. Well, that's exactly what I was doing when I was 21 years old. I was a janitor at the University of Chicago in the library. And so we had that in common as well. So I wrote back to the guy and said, I think this is fascinating. Show me what you've got. He sent me a couple of chapters. They were absolutely amazing. I said that was fantastic. I said, when your book comes out, maybe you ought to come out here to Arlington Heights and we'll have a book signing for you. And he said, terrific. And a few weeks ago, I got a copy of the book. and he is with us here tonight. Cedric Keith is a remarkable guy. He, I think like many of us, has an open mind to a lot of things. He's willing to learn. He's willing to change his position when things are brought to his attention. His experience in the wilderness taught him a number of things about man's relationship to nature, and maybe a little bit about public policy, about how then we should as a society respond to environmental problems and some other problems. He's going to talk about his experience, talk about his book, I guess for 20 or 30 minutes. Is that the plan, Cedric? And then he's going to take questions from all of you for another 30 minutes or so. So please welcome the author of The Dying Fish, A Sojourn to the Source by Cedric Keith. Cedric Keith. All right. And there's your bottle of water.
Thanks a lot. And thank you all for taking time to come out this evening. I really do appreciate it. So, I think I need to definitely start by thanking the Heartland Institute for having this largely unrecognized author out this evening, all the way from Pittsburgh. I appreciate that tremendously. And more precisely, I want to specifically thank Joseph Bast for inviting me. It seems that he caught the vision on this last winter when I thought it existed in my head alone, and he expressed an awful lot of enthusiasm to get me out here, and I appreciate that more than he knows, I'm sure. I also want to thank President Obama for graciously allowing me to keep nearly half of my income tax return this year, with which I released a pretty good book. So that being said, I'm not entirely sure how I got here, who any of you are, or why I'm wearing this funny clothes tonight. But I do think I know that this is an institution dedicated to ideas like the resistance to bureaucratic expansion, to the preservation of our enumerated liberties, and to free market ideals, and you'll have to pardon me. I don't speak often. I speak a couple of times a year, and I've certainly never given this speech before. So I'm going to take my time and make sure I get it right. Tonight, I don't want to bore you with more of the same, or, I'm sorry, in accordance with recently revived fairness doctrine standards, I take it this is a place where a rabble of gun-toting climate denialists gathers to undermine public education and dethrone science. So that being said, and that's just protocol, just housekeeping, and completely mandatory. That being said, I don't want to bore you with more of the same tonight. I want to talk to you about brook trout. And after all Joe generously said from the podium just now, that was one aspect of my project he didn't really touch on. That for me it was all about the native trout of the eastern mountains, and I was seeking the preservation of this species when I went out. They remain of great concern to me, and I think I can say that maybe I hold claim or I can say it this way, that they remain deeply important to me, the preservation of this species. Maybe I have claim to that more than anyone because I went out and spent a large chunk of my life studying them and living out there in the wild alone among the wild trout. That being said, while our president pushes forward or fast tracks his socialist dystopia, while one of our presidential candidates wants more of the same, and the other presidential candidate seems an even less attractive alternative at times, I want to talk to you about wild trout tonight. While all the world, or all Europe, I should say, is consumed in a post-Brexit conflagration, I want to talk to you about the trout that persist at the headwater sources. I think more than anything tonight, that's what I would really like to talk about. Brook trout, to the uninitiated, I'm just going to assume it's not a favorite of everyone here in the room, and maybe that's not why you really came out after all. Brook trout, they're taken among ichthyologists, people who study fish all the time, as a sign, a hallmark of pure and perfect water. They exist near the spring sources, in sometimes crystal clear water, very unpolluted, clean water. And when you find them, you know that not only is that stream perfect in some sense, but the watershed surrounding that stream is as perfect as you could hope for. They are relatively intolerant of changes we make in the land, hence they tend to be found in remote places. They're opportunist feeders, as most fish have to be. They consume what's most readily available within the realm of insects and smaller fishes, grading towards a more piscine diet or a fish diet as they grow larger. And for larger, for brook trout, this means surpassing 10 inches or so. This is not a big fish, which was something I've had to explain to many people who are really unfamiliar with trout or with aquatic ecology, that these fishes in most of Appalachia average 5.5 inches or so. These are itty-bitty fish, easily overlooked. Although I might say once you're holding one in your hand, there's nothing more spectacular. They make an impression, and an impression that can stay with you a lifetime, as I can attest, because I used to catch these things when I was very young in eastern Canada with Dad's help, and in western Maine, where I primarily grew up. And they're really beautiful fish, captivating, and to go on with a little bit of further description of them, because some of this is sort of essential to understand, to get the more scientific aspects of the book. I don't need to go in depth with you tonight. I'll try to avoid that. They spawn late in the fall, or I should say from late September to early November, depending on the throughout the range of the species. I think of them really as, more than anything, a Canadian fish, where it's in Canada, the eastern two-thirds of Canada, that they reach their greatest population density and greatest size overall. And here in the continental United States, they're very prevalent in about 4/5 of Maine or so, and prevalent in northern New England. And then sort of as a vestige population as you continue south, say south of Pennsylvania, it becomes a narrower and narrower, more and more constricted range all the way down to Georgia, where they persist at high elevations within the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains are what allow them to persist, because they exist kind of on the cusp of their thermal tolerance within southern Appalachia. Kind of a big issue for them, and thermal issues become significant in the book. I'm not going to go into them in great detail tonight. And so I mentioned they spawn in the fall. The eggs overwinter in gravel in the headwaters of the headwater streams, little tiny streams where you wouldn't think you'd find a fish larger than 2 inches. Large adults migrate up into the headwaters. The females obviously lay the eggs in gravel, and the fish, the young fish as eggs, sit in that gravel and incubate through the winter, so that from birth they're acclimatizing to very, very cold temperatures, which is characteristic of this species. But there's something else going on at the spawning sites that we're generally insensible to as we walk around and look at these waters, that the adults have found a groundwater upwelling at that site. And this is just really crucial to understanding brook trout ecology, something inescapable in my book. My book goes in a lot of directions ultimately, but you're going to learn a lot about the ecology of brook trout. Groundwater is vital to the species, and also from birth they've been placed at sites of groundwater upwelling, and that's how they survive. How they survive very cold winters in very cold places, because the groundwater has a constant temperature to it throughout the year. And later in life, and through changing environmental extremes of different kinds, the groundwater remains their last bastion in areas that are generally much too warm or have extreme summers where you wouldn't expect them to survive. Whole populations will survive by going down to the spring sources and living with their noses at those emission sites. So that is a pretty good synopsis of the ecology of the brook trout, I think. Huge parts that I left out, I'm sure. But even the brook trout have problems, as you might have imagined. They have environmental problems, and there are 4 that are most significant. Number 1 could be categorized as changes in the land. And yes, since settlement, starting at around 1600, the land began to change pretty dramatically. As far as the 1200, or I should say 12,000 year time scale goes, which goes back to the last glaciation. The change was rapid since 1600 as we cleared land and did all the things that settlers did when they got here. Most of that did not favor the brook trout. So changes in the land, along with that rising temperatures, and this comes primarily from the clearing of the riparian vegetation, or the trees that shade the water. The waters warmed and became more inhospitable to trout, and sedimentation, which comes from construction, but also again from the degradation of bankside vegetation, allowing sediment to come loose during rain events and wash into the stream. For reasons I won't explain right now, the brook trout do not do well with a huge sediment load in their water course. So the last of the 4 really significant issues, I think, was non-native fishes that have been introduced into their waters. And this one is a particular area of concentration for me, and it's particularly insidious, because it's difficult to remedy. Once a new fish is in there and they've established themselves, it's almost impossible to get rid of them except by the most extreme types of poisoning, where you essentially kill everything in the stream. And mainly this means, as far as invasives go, this means brown trout and rainbow trout. Very nice fish, I'm sure. One comes from Europe and one comes from the Rocky Mountains. Both introduced around the mid-19th century to eastern waters, and they don't cohabitate well with the brook trout. Those are the most significant problems for the brook trout as identified by the work of a consortium of scientists called the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture, who released their initial findings around 2006. It was really a thorough project. I enjoyed very much reading all of their work, but they went watershed by watershed and worked with fisheries managers and concerned citizens groups, fly fishing groups, and so forth throughout the range of the species, and looked for best estimations of the quality of the remaining populations watershed by watershed within the eastern United States. And so those problems that I just enumerated came to the forefront. And this report found its way into my hands in 2007. And I said, wow, it looks to me like a rapid decline for the native brook trout. I think it's probably more accurate to say huge decline since pre-colonial population levels. And it's always a guess as to what the quality of the habitat and the quality of brook trout populations were in pre-Columbian days. But we have a lot of clues. We know that brook trout ran by the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions, into the estuarine waters of Long Island. And they were particularly prevalent in the small streams of Manhattan that no longer exist. There were, and these were salt or brook trout, meaning that they run in from the ocean. They're anadromous, if I can throw out some big fisheries terminology. They run in from the ocean and spawn in the rivers. So there were things like that are just unheard of anymore. Now the brook trout exist as the kind of vestige I've described near the mountain crests. And so I said, well, this looks like really rapid decline for the species. And I think the very next thought was, well, what can I do about it? And I had a not so great job in Pittsburgh. In a lot of ways, you could say fairly enough that I was down and out. And again, without elaborating greatly, I probably didn't have a lot going for me. But I recognized this unique moment of freedom in my life. I said, I'm really free to move. I've made myself debt-free for the first time in a while. I don't really have any serious relationships holding me down. I could do something crazy and incredible. And another prevalent idea in my thinking at the time, throughout childhood and going through my teen years, I was very much into technical fisheries literature. I consumed the stuff like candy. It wasn't brand new to me. This is just how maybe how I kept my mind engaged. So an idea that was very prevalent in my thinking by this time was that what's written in the technical journals remains dead words on the page to most of us, and most of us never see it. It's circulated among universities, and those think tanks. They see it sometimes, but it doesn't affect most of us. So I thought, what if I could write some kind of book about what's happening with the brook trout that would just be more engaging, more readable to everyday average citizens, and I could embed all the conservation ideas that I think are so important in that story. And I thought, what would that look like? I could interview a lot of researchers, and I could do a lot of research on the internet and find out all kinds of wonderful facts. But that's not so great. No one would read that, and it wouldn't be that interesting if they did. And I thought, well, what if I actually went out there and spent time in the wild around the wild brook trout? And very shortly thereafter, could I walk through the entire native range of the species within the eastern United States from Georgia all the way to the New Brunswick border in northern Maine? And I had no answer for that. Could I do it? But once the idea was in my mind, that's really what I wanted to do. I suppose that there was a day the following summer where I found myself standing on the edge of a Georgia cornfield with a ridiculously overburdened backpack, with all of the things I would need to survive or thought I would need to survive for the next month or so in the wild. Although I was beginning a hike of months, I knew, and I had no experience at this point doing any type of hiking of this scale. Nothing remotely close to this, but there I was in the heat of the Georgia summer with this ridiculous pack on, and a second pack strapped to the first pack holding all my study gear. I could hardly move under the thing, and I was looking north at a low blue ridge of mountains that still lay well to the north of me, and started to walk. At that moment I began a half decade of incredible unlearning and relearning, beginning, I think, as close to the philosopher's fabled position of ignorance as humanly possible. My views would change radically in the years ahead, and it was an incredible journey. Had I left the trout out of it completely, it would have been an incredible journey. With that incredible moment of freedom, I started walking, and I started grunting and straining and hauling the pack up mountainsides, and sleeping out among the wild animals at night. And I found out it was drastically different than I could have imagined. I considered myself a fairly experienced outdoorsman at this point, and this was so far beyond anything I'd done before, and it was. There was just an ominous sense that I can't describe. I'm sure I was unable to do it justice in the book. I can't really describe it to you tonight, of being alone out there in the wild and knowing that you're walking hundreds of miles in the months ahead, and you look out from a high mountain ridge day after day and see nothing but more wilderness. And you don't know what's out there and what you're going to encounter by the time you pitch the tent again the next night, or fall asleep on the leaves the next night, or whatever. But you're incredibly free, so I found very quickly that it wasn't at all as I had imagined from the comfort of my Pittsburgh apartment. Where I may have imagined myself skipping across the hills and dales of the Appalachian Mountains, cooking hot dogs on the fire, and going down to fly fish for brook trout at my leisure. Particularly in respect to the study, it was just enormously more difficult than that. The reality of the Appalachian wilds didn't at all fit neatly into my study design that, again, had been fabricated in the comfort of a Pittsburgh apartment. And the study, just so you can have some idea, it would involve determining presence or absence of the fish with a fly rod, which is a fine implement to employ in reference to brook trout and the little tiny streams they occupy. But then I would go through with a set of electronic metering equipment and look at pH and dissolved oxygen, ridiculously look at dissolved oxygen, which there was no need for whatsoever, and that meter did not come with me on subsequent trips to the mountains. And I would look at benthic invertebrates, the little things crawling across the bottom. I would net these, and I would measure the discharge of the stream, how much water in cubic feet per second is passing any given point. And so those were the types of things I would do, and I found it was incredibly difficult to come down off the mountain crest in a single day, execute a full study on a stream, and get back up. My data set, such as it was, became very study sites were few and far between. It wasn't consistent, and I think I would characterize the whole first expedition well, more than any other word, I would use the word failure. And I came back with very little data, not nearly reaching my goals concerning the fish, but I had learned to live out there in the wild, and I had learned something about my limits and how far I could push on, and that there wasn't really anything that was going to kill me out there. Most likely, there's always the potential, but most likely, no, I'm going to be okay, and had gotten beyond some of the initial fear. So I went home and regrouped and figured out a different kind of more streamlined study program, got my hands on some better gear, which is not necessarily more expensive gear. In fact, it was not at all. It was just gear better suited to living out there for months at a time, and just overall formulated a better plan. And I went back to the south again a second year. I didn't continue on into Pennsylvania. The first year's trip had ended in West Virginia, and I went back down to Georgia to do the hike back up again and reach the Pennsylvania line this time, which I did. The next year was more expeditious, more rewarding. I got on a lot more trout water, collected a lot more data on the fish, and enjoyed myself more. It was still there wasn't a day it wasn't tough, and it's just the little things, the little cumulative things or chronic things of being out there that tend to wear you down. It's the foot soreness and the bugs all over you all the time, and at night the discomfort of the heat and not being able to sleep well, and 100 little things like that. It's just so infinitely different when you can't walk over to a light switch and have the whole world illuminated around you, or turn on a water faucet and have water just because you need some. If you need it, you often have to descend and go find some water for yourself. So reality came to mean something much different from being out there on the trail, and it became a growing sense of mine throughout the years of this trip that I was in closer contact with reality than I'd ever been before, and so much of this world back here just came to seem so fabricated, and that's where I think my viewpoint on a lot of things started to shift. I'm going to think for a minute about time here. Let me head towards a conclusion. I observed through the latter portion of West Virginia and through Pennsylvania some really excellent habitat. And in fact, through a lot of the South too, really unexpectedly excellent habitat. But it really jumped out at me in Pennsylvania that supposedly the habitat is so degraded for brook trout. They're barely hanging on in a lot of places, but it just wasn't what I saw. I saw watershed after watershed that was rich with plentiful trout, plentiful of the plentiful native brook trout, and self-sustaining populations of brook trout. Nothing the state came and dumped there out of a truck, a favorite of the Pennsylvania way of angling. That's also addressed in the book. So I found excellent habitat. The idea had become very paramount in my thinking by this point of the connectivity between the brook trout and his habitat, that as goes his watershed, so goes the trout, and I could almost walk into a new watershed and tell whether there were going to be trout down in the stream along the lowest contours of that valley, just from looking at the valley itself. And the valleys were beautiful in Pennsylvania, richly wooded, and just, hundreds of miles of richly wooded forest that you might have expected in Maine, but not in Pennsylvania. While trying to recover from Lyme disease in the latter portion of that hike, I got to thinking. It was one of those periods of serious thinking, and I don't know if I said it all already, but It's something that maybe makes my book different as far as environmental reading goes, that it's a very personal story, and it traces the evolution of my thinking on these things. So it doesn't take any of that for granted, and it doesn't beat you over the head with theory. As I said, I started out almost in ignorance on these things, and I have this chronicle here now of my changing thinking. So back to this midpoint, I'm a little bit depressed. I'm recovering from Lyme disease, and I'm thinking about all this wonderful, perfect habitat I've passed through. And the book I had thought I might write about the perishing brook trout, and just was stuck with the thought of, well, what do I have now to write? If I write a book that says the habitat's actually doing really good, and it's recovering and kind of doing what it's always done, regenerating and healing itself over time, that's not an environmental Jeremiad exactly. So who's going to read that? What story do I have left to tell? Why even bother at this point? And so I kind of came to the conclusion, or conclusion would be the wrong word, because I tried to avoid those to tell the end, and still, by the end, leave a lot of things open-ended after telling my story. But I thought, I'm just going to pursue this thing to its conclusion. I'm going to finish the walk. I'm going to look at the trout streams and see where it all takes me in the end. And then I thought to myself as well that it may be that the real story that needs a book written about it is this story of immense recovery in the Northeast. I didn't know at that point how immense I was talking about, but this incredible resurgence of the great Northeastern wilderness that's not getting a lot of coverage, and its implications. So you're going to run into that in the second half of the book. I think I'd also say, should you choose to take a look at this book, please pursue it to its conclusion. I think, in fact, I'm certain the most important part of the book is in the last third, and that doesn't give anyone permission to skip ahead. But the best of the book is the last third, and it's a book that transitions radically, and in the early parts it's very simple-minded, and it's this guy bumbling around who doesn't have a clue out there in the forest. Please read on through. There's more to come. It gets better, and so.
You shouldn't feel like you have to wrap this up right away. I may have misspoken about how long. Keep going.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Although you shouldn't tell me. You shouldn't tell me that. I normally speak for 3 hours at a time, so let me see if I can step it down from that from that point. I'll tell you there was another conflict building within myself throughout this journey. I had been raised in the church and in a generally American conservative upbringing, with all the very typical ideas of that upbringing. And I was out on this environmental crusade, and it was always this little nagging thing in the back of my mind that I tried to suppress, that conservatives don't go out on environmental crusades. How am I going to resolve this? How am I going to explain this to my conservative friends? And so, again, this is a lot of what we're chronicling in the book, how I reached resolution on that. And on that point, I think I've got to say that the resolution was really right before my eyes all along, as I looked at a self-maintaining wild system that needed no direction from higher authority, needed no central planning. It took care of itself, healed itself, and directives from a higher authority could have only stifled its ability to heal and grow and perpetuate itself. So that's what I came to see in the wilderness, And I think in so doing, I also glimpsed a higher social order somewhere off through the trees from time to time. And I was also impressed with the idea, the theory that America itself sprang maybe not as much, or it sprang as much from wilderness, and the idea of wilderness as from the storied tradition of classical liberalism that we tend to pay so much attention to. I think it's largely neglected, the idea that of the close connection of so many of our founding fathers to wilderness, and this was the environment they came out of, George Washington being the best example of this. So again, there I'm going to kind of leave that loose end hanging out there for tonight. It's elaborated on quite a bit in the book. And finally, here's something from the Adirondacks. A day later, I'd camped out beside a diminutive and cascading little brook, safe from the drizzle beneath the awning of an Adirondack trail shelter, identical to many Appalachian trail shelters I'd occupied in recent years. The incessant pelting on the leaves blended with the rushing din of the plunging watercourse. It was all perfect here, cool rain falling on the mountain, absorbed by spruces and sphagnum, and some runoff even winding up between the stream banks where it would all join in the plunge into the icy fathoms of Lake Placid. The brook trout would appreciate all of this. The new water would carry with it organic particles to innervate the periphyton and filter-feeding caddises. The high water would help to hide them from fishers, both two-legged and four-legged. And a couple of months from now, the residual seeps from these summer rains would help to ensure that gravelly nesting sites remained submerged through the fall. A thin green line passed between my fingers, and weightless feathers whisked between encroaching firs and alders. I was only a more dexterous otter loon or fisher. That perfect fly-propelling motion was performed mindlessly now, the 6.5-foot graphite tube just the longest of my fingers, pointing toward dark, deep crevices between the rocks, ordering my obedient lure to interdict the escaping currents. The stream initially impressed me as maybe too small, but then a trout seized a number 18 gnat, and I was holding a first specimen, brookie, of course. The stream was thick with them. The whole watercourse was neatly segregated into distinct pools, broken by short waterfalls or chutes, and the brookies here were willing participants in my ongoing survey of the eastern streams. And momentarily, again, the broader scientific goals of the long-term study were forgotten, replaced by the sheer joy of wild speckled trout in an untamed place tugging on the end of my line. And this, I think, may be the essence of the joy of angling. This is our chance in an ever more tame, repressed world to connect physically to something wild, to feel it pulse and struggle as though its life depended on it, to sway for a moment, as it were, in the primal dance of predator and prey, the ageless contest of life itself. Thank you for your attention. Thank you all for coming out.
That was great. I love your voice. It's like, I might hire you for some narration work we have here at the Heartland Institute. And it is kind of nice that I think it's the first time in Heartland Institute history there is more than one person who can answer questions about Pittsburgh, which is nice. So now's the night for it. All right, it's time for Q&A, which is always fun, so don't be shy. Just raise your hand, and somebody with a microphone will come to you, Honor over there, or myself over here. And please don't touch the microphone. Let the professional microphone handlers do their job. That ensures that it's nice and clear for everybody here and on the live stream watching at home. And of course, on the live stream, if you could put the word question in all caps before your question, it makes it easier for us to see it and ask it to our guest tonight. So with that, hands up.
Yes. Oh,
Cedric, is one thing I wasn't clear from your remarks is how seriously threatened are the brook trout, number one? And if so, how does local, state, and federal policy, what's your view on how they affect the outcome of this? The outcome being, if you could, you know, reestablish the populations to a more, normal, quote-unquote level?
Okay. First I would say, broadly speaking, the brook trout are really doing great. I sat down and talked to one researcher in Vermont, not researcher, but more of a state policy manager, environmental policy manager, who said, we don't even spend much time on the brook trout. The lower elevation places are places where they've been gone. It's been farmland for 200 years now, and it's never going to be brook trout habitat again. The higher elevations of the Green Mountains are wonderful, spectacular brook trout fisheries, and there's no point in even wasting our limited dollars on that. And also, I might mention that the book is not purely my observations and speculations on these matters. I interviewed a lot of people along the way, and it's an interesting little dynamic of the book that all along the way I'm physically passing by these research centers. Some of them I kind of skewed my route a little bit to be sure to take them in, USGS facilities, and New York DEC, Pennsylvania DEP type offices to sit down and talk with the people who are studying these fish. It's kind of a tangent, but I really like a lot of these guys. They work in government offices. Some of them received my book for free. I went and took it back to them. They are stuck in working in government offices. They tell me about the drag of the bureaucracy, and sometimes the wastefulness of it. But I think what's at play there is that there were young people like myself who became enraptured, fascinated with fish at an early age, went out and caught fish, and the people who are most likely to pay them to work with fish, or wildlife for that matter, are the state agencies. So you have a lot of great guys too. Some of them fairly conservative and libertarian thinking actually embedded in these agencies. It's been my finding. Some of them just really outstanding individuals who contributed a great deal to my work. That was kind of a tangent, but you were asking how could they impact the brook trout, the current status of the brook trout populations.
The title of your book is Dying Fish, so I kind of assumed that this was a fish species that was going extinct. Well,
Right.
You're telling me something different now.
Yes,
than
I
the
am.
title of the book implies. That's all.
Oh, okay, and glad you mentioned it too. The title of the book, for anyone such as this gentleman here, I'm sorry, your name again? David. The title of the book is purposely deceptive. It doesn't mean what you think it means. And about halfway through the book, you're going to say, aha, I get it now. And then about 3/4 of the way through the book, you're going to say, okay, now I know what he meant by the dying fish. There are serious allegories at play in this work. And when you're reading the very simple-minded stuff at the beginning, pay attention. It's building to something, and it's allegorical. So the title doesn't mean what you think it means.
So I'm Diane, and I'm just wondering, is there more study of brook trout in your future, or are you moving on to a different species?
Okay, as far as next projects go, I have a couple of more books in the serious planning stages right now, neither of which will deal with brook trout. I remain fascinated by the fish, as I said, the fish that enthralled me as a child, and I can't forget about them. I want to be a participant in educating people as far as the conservation of these fish and what we can do. My tact on that tends to be more what can we as citizens and particularly as private property owners do to ensure the health of the streams that run through our property. And you know, I like to give out ideas that people can voluntarily incorporate into the management of their stream. So my next projects aren't likely to be specifically directed at the brook trout. Sir.
My name is John. You mentioned that many of the government officials you came across were conservative or libertarian in their thinking. But there are also examples in the past where some of these agencies tend to be hostile towards people taking an interest in the environment or going into the backwoods. Did you encounter any hostile environment, and what are a couple examples you can tell us?
The Smoky Mountains, you're going to run into that early in the book. And this was back in the period where I really didn't know what I was doing either, and I ran into two of the most high-ranking officials there are in the Smoky Mountains doing their annual walkthrough. I didn't know who they were at the time. I later figured it out, and they didn't want me there in the Smoky Mountains doing anything. Unfortunately, it was hard to get rid of me. This is an adventure story, and there are a number of encounters recounted in that story. U.S. Border Patrol at gunpoint twice. But as far as run-ins like that with government officials, it happened. Yes, it's a wonderful part of the story. And the second time it happened, I just started laughing. You guys made my day. Thank you for contributing to the Eastern Brook Trout solo adventure.
So you spoke a little bit about, I think you phrased it this way, kind of the wilderness is reclaiming the land, and maybe the wilderness is a little bit more wild and thick and adventurous than you had anticipated. Because I don't think a lot of people think, when if you watch Marlon Perkins growing up as a kid, think the wilderness. It's always out in the Rocky Mountains with those pumas and cougars and bobcats and stuff. You don't think about an area that's relatively populated by human beings in the Appalachian Mountains, at least state by state, as being the wild. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that may have surprised you and what you really meant by the kind of the wilderness reclaiming the land.
Okay. And I think there's maybe a couple of different questions to address there. One is about, just really what we mean by wilderness, and that is a matter I explored throughout the second half of the book and never answered. I felt it inappropriate to try to give a definitive answer to what is wilderness, and a lot of people have tried. The Department of the Interior has certainly tried, and various environmental bureaucracies tried to really pin it down. I did not want to do that. And as far as the eastern wilderness goes, what it was 100 years ago is much different than what it is today. And this is a dynamic that almost no one seems to understand. 100 years ago, the Appalachian Mountains largely were denuded. There were farmsteads all over them, and I love to talk about Pennsylvania this way. I'm more familiar with it than any other state, and it's just a great example. Strip mining was rampant. It was timbered off generally twice. It actually, funny thing, it has more virgin timber standing than anywhere in the East, remarkably, which still isn't much, but. It was largely denuded, strip mined. The oil well drilling began in about 1860. It was in terrible shape by the time we got to 1900, 1920, and I mean the serious strip mining didn't really even start till the 1930s, 1940s, and ran into the late 70s. So what it was is amazingly different than what it is today, and the dynamic, if you're concerned about environmental matters like I am, the movement is in the right direction, and it's not because of any great grand design by state agencies wanting to rewild Pennsylvania or anything like that. The wilderness has just come back in a big way through changing economics over time. And so it's an incredibly wild place nowadays. I can't, really address specifically putting it up against Colorado or putting it up against Montana. I believe the northern Rockies is still, yes, a wilder place, but the northern Appalachians, Adirondacks, mountains of New England are incredibly wild nowadays.
So Joe mentioned that when he was in his early 20s, he hiked some of the Appalachian Trail. He wants to do that again after we retire. He wants to bring me along when we do that. Is he crazy for wanting to do this at his age?
Yes. No. No. There are people even older than your husband who I see out there on the trail, specifically on the Appalachian Trail. And just something to clarify there, I used the Appalachian Trail quite a bit, but I used over 300 different trails to pursue this 4,400 mile route, roughly twice the length of the Appalachian Trail through the east. But I wouldn't say crazy at all. And if you can survive the first week, you've got it. It's all a matter of acclimating to something radically different. It's all mental.
I have a question.
You are?
I'm Veronica. I'm the marketing director here at the Heartland Institute. So the guy who emailed my CEO months ago is not the guy standing before us today. And you said that this journey has transformed you in a way that you think differently, policies are different in your mind now. Talk to us a little bit about that transition and what that difference looks like for you and for anyone in your support system who has now had to embrace the change. What does that look like for you now?
Okay. I think I mentioned it at least briefly. One of the most fundamental things and first things that I really felt changing was that I have an incredibly different idea of what reality is, what's real and fundamental and elemental, and it's not computers, I don't think, or anything connected to the grid, fortunately, it's not all of the things our friends are saying on Facebook. It's not the things people are gossiping about or just people in general are so caught up in. That stuff all just came to seem so fabricated, and I really was in sympathy, even by the time the second year of the trip rolled around with, what's his name, Chris McCandless, who wrote, and they made a movie of it that took a very lefty twist, unfortunately, but Chris McCandless was the character in this book, the young man who went out and wandered all over the West, and he just described so much of what he'd left behind in, I believe it was around the maybe Hampton area of Virginia as just fake. He just used that word over and over again, and I know what he meant. So also, though, by the time we're in the latter portions of the book, there's another word I'm using a lot, and that is wild. That was the title of the book, by the way, Into the Wild. But there's this feeling of wildness, and I'm starting to explore this idea in my mind, this compulsion in wild creatures to resist constrainment and to be able to do things aggressively and to ward off competitors. And but by the time we're in the late portions of the book, I have a really great discussion with a friend of mine who meets me at Lake Placid, where we sit down, and I'm saying, Jack, this is what's really in my mind right now, wildness, and I know I'm a wilder creature than I was when I came out here, and the wilderness is what does this to you, and our separation from wilderness is what makes us a more docile, complacent kind of creature, easily pushed around, easily subdued and put in our place, maybe by the government. But those are some of the ideas we head towards late in the book.
All right. Hey, Cedric, over here. So, did you have any close encounters with wildlife that you can share with us?
Each and every day, and it's something that the students where I often talk really want to know about. Always, they want to know about bears, and you know, on another tangent first, in the movies you see people in the wilderness falling off cliffs and getting inundated with a huge flood out of nowhere, and bears coming into camp, and out there in the wild. Those aren't the things, after you've been out there a long time, they're not the kinds of things you really worry about and realize are going to kill you. It's the insidious things over time that really threaten your life. But back to your question. Yes, and in my first year, the bear encounters were at their most dramatic just because I wasn't accustomed to it yet. I wasn't accustomed to waking up in the middle of the night with one of these things coming around my sleeping bag, looking me over, trying to get at my backpack, and I didn't quite know how to communicate effectively with them yet. It sounds funny, and I say it in a joking way, but that's exactly what I learned to do, and I got along great with the bears overall. And I've been really up close and personal with a number of them. The first one was in the Smoky Mountains, the day before I ran into the director of the Smoky Mountains and his assistant. The night before, I'd been sleeping on a mountainside, which I absolutely was not supposed to do according to park policy, and a bear had come after me in the middle of the night, and it was the first time I'd ever encountered an adult bear in the wild, and it was incredibly dramatic, and he stood up on his hind legs at a range of about from me to that table, and my light beam fell on him, and that's how I saw him, but he just stood up, and he was a seriously big bear, and he really wanted my backpack. And I picked up the hatchet that always laid next to my head when I was sleeping out in the open like that, as if I was really going to do anything with that, and just yelled at him this primal growling yell that I didn't know I had, and he just tumbled away down the mountainside and was gone. And I just thought, wow, that not for public consumption, I assure you. And I've done it a number of times. I did it 2 weeks later when I encountered big wild pigs for the first time and walked between their babies and the two older ones. I did the same thing. So it's a sound I'm perfectly capable of, but I never do it in civilization. Sorry.
From when you first started writing your book, like first started writing down the first words, how long did it take you to finish? And then was what you envisioned when you started what you ended up with?
Okay, those are good questions. So first, the primary writing of the book happened in journals. The data was mostly collected in a little tiny notebook that pretty much never left my back pocket, a series, and now quite a stack of those little tiny notebooks. Then there was a journal that I'd write in every night. There's quite a stack of these journals back home right now. But that wasn't really the writing of the book, and I saved that until I was really all done with the project, and I kind of wanted to be able to see the big picture. And so largely, I would say that when I finally got started to really writing the book, what I had in mind was about what the final version looked like. Yeah. Okay, the writing of the book took roughly 3 years. And of course, I'm not a writer by trade, and I don't have research assistants or anything like that. I'm working a full-time job, doing whatever in Pittsburgh during this time, and so I just do this in my spare time, and it took 3 years. Yes. Anything further? Yes, ma'am.
Donna, did you encounter any people living in the Appalachians? Did you stay at their house or have dinner with them or something like that? Is that in the book?
Okay, the overall, I tried not to encounter people as much as I could. I just don't know the people out there, and I didn't have any particular business with them. I was content to keep to myself. Most of the time I was in what you would really call the Appalachians, which is kind of Georgia up through West Virginia, the first 2 journeys. I was up mostly along the high ridge of the Appalachians, and the mountain folk generally populate the lower reaches, and you just don't run into hillbillies out there along the mountain crest. Along the mountain crest runs the Appalachian Trail, and that is kind of a vigorous international community of generally younger people, and so you'll be down there in the deep south running into people from France and people from Ottawa and people from all over. So it's another interesting aspect that I didn't even touch on, colorful characters. And while I wanted to originally, back when this was all in the planning stages, just write a book about trout science and the conservation of trout and everything everyone needs to know about conserving trout, because I realized at some point the book needs to be interesting to other people than myself as well. Colorful characters come into play a lot and often really serve a purpose, aside from just being an aside, a point of distraction or interest. They really play a role, and there are some very genuine Appalachian characters. A couple of them come to mind who it's kind of dramatic moments and involving hunting bears with dogs and me helping to track down a lost bear dog through the Appalachian Mountains. And yeah, it's just something else that's an added spice in those early chapters.
I have a question. So you said it's not the bears that you're worried about, other than that first night, which it's fine. But you said it was the insidious things that really, over a longer term that had you worried about it. Yeah. And then you went right to the bear and didn't tell us what those insidious things were. So I wonder if you could expand.
Well,
on that.
They're just not that exciting. That's why they're insidious. And it's the things like your clothes and equipment wearing out. And just the strain of those straps on your shoulders and the boots wearing on your feet, and just being wet most of the time, even though you're not fording streams and stuff all the time, you're wet just about all the time, and you learn to move in these dynamics that would be strange and foreign here in the civilized world, of just constantly pursuing dry, and you get into camp and you strip naked, and all the clothes gets thrown up on branches around camp in preferably a fairly windy spot, and you learn to seek out optimal places for getting everything dry. The tent and stuff should be kept as dry as possible, and you're always in this quest for dry while you're out there. So these things wear on you, and in fact, just as a demonstration of that and how radical a change it is, going back to the Appalachian Trail, it begins at and the name just left my mind, the southern terminus of the Appalachian, Springer Mountain, Georgia. And I think it's 30 to 35 miles along. There's a place called Neal's Gap, where there's a hiker hostel, which are wonderful places along the Appalachian Trail that you absolutely could not appreciate here in the civilized world. They just have the most basic amenities and something to eat in a bunk. So there's this hostel called Neal's Gap. There are, and I can't recall right off the top of my head now, but there are over 1,000 prospective Appalachian Trail through hikers who begin at Springer, typically each March, trying to hike the entire Appalachian Trail through to Mount Katahdin, Maine, 2,200 miles away. And so among these hopefuls who start out, roughly a quarter of them are ready to call it quits by the time they get to Neal's Gap, 30 to 35 miles in. And you might not be able to understand that at all. But that's how drastic a thing it is. And these are people who've gotten ready, who've done their research on the internet, have figured it all out, and they're ready to jump into it. And then they find out, just after getting started, that this is not for me. There's a show on maybe Discovery Channel. I might be wrong about that, but it's called Alone. And I rarely watch TV, but I saw a few episodes of that recently, and there are these very experienced outdoors people they choose for this, and they thrust them into these situations out there in the wild where they are absolutely stranded, absolutely alone, and have to fend for themselves out there. That's the premise, and you see who lasts the longest, absolutely alone out there. And so you have these very tough, rugged-looking guys at day 17, 18, 19, throwing in their hat, calling it quits. And they really kind of look wimpy on TV, and you're just sitting there thinking, oh, I'd last longer than that. And I've just got to say, try it. And you find out very, very quickly.
All right, we have a question online from R.J. Smith, who I believe was from Competitive Enterprise Institute, or may still be there. Hello, R.J. Thanks for watching. He asks, what is the connection between libertarianism, free market philosophy, and private conservation or free market environmentalism?
Okay, and that's one of those matters saved for very late in the book, and I don't want to expound on it at length tonight, but I see great potential for private land to become at least as important, if not more important, than public. And I demonstrate places over and over again throughout my route where fish and wildlife and the environment itself is thriving on private land, and often by accident, not by design. But there are places where by design private citizens set this aside long ago as a preserve. I spend a good bit of time on this in the Adirondacks in particular. But I just see this enormous potential on the horizon for, if we have the will for it, for private property to eclipse public in the conservation of wildlife. And I really love the idea because it takes the wind out of the sails of the bureaucracy. It takes away a lot of the impetus to kind of crush all of us under the weight of the regulatory burden we're all so familiar with through the EPA and other agencies. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. I expand on it some in the book.
Have any other questions? Our work is done. Let's give our speaker a round of applause, please. All right. Well, thank you. I know I'm kind of inspired to go fishing this weekend, so thanks for that. Thank you all for being here tonight. Just a quick reminder: there's some papers on your tables that says how we did, how are we doing, to kind of give your feedback on this event, and I hope you will take the time to fill that out so we can get better every single time. And there's also a form in there with a balloon, and a hot air balloon on it, and a picture of Ronald Reagan, and that's how you can get more involved in the Heartland Institute as a volunteer, as a donor, as somebody who helps promote these events to your own groups. So I hope that you will consider doing that in the future. If you look at this card on your table, it's got our upcoming events. Beautiful new card, just released a couple of weeks ago. On Wednesday, July 20th, Timothy Sandifer and Christina Sandifer will be here talking about property rights in 21st century America, especially after the Kelo decision in the Supreme Court from several years back. So if you care about property rights, I think you need to come to that one for sure next week or on the 20th. And then on Wednesday, July 27th, Eric O'Keefe, the hero of Wisconsin, the man who slayed the John Doe witch hunts up there in Wisconsin. It's something you're not going to want to miss. It's called The Use of State Power to Silence Patriots. And he's a survivor of that experience, so I hope you'll be here on the 27th of July for him to see that. And of course, this card here is for our benefit dinner on September 15th, which is a Thursday in Palatine, Illinois, with P.J. O'Rourke as our keynote speaker. And we're about to announce publicly that Morton Blackwell is getting the, so you got that here. I guess it is public now. Morton Blackwell will be getting the Heartland Liberty Prize. So we're very much looking forward to honoring that great champion of liberty at our benefit dinner in September. And once again, the book here is The Dying Fish, and Cedric will be available for more discussion and to sign copies of his book on your way out. Again, thank you for being here, and we hope to see you next time.